Okay, everyone. On behalf of the Fritt Ord Foundation, I would like to give a warm welcome to everyone. On this event on journalism during corona, it's our first public meeting in a long time here at the Fritt Ord Foundation, so it's really nice to see so many people here tonight. My name is Joachim Lie, and I have the pleasure of working with OsloMet University, especially with Kristin Augeré and Roy Krøvel on preparing this event. It was very nice of you to approach us and that we could do this now. So our starting point today is what we have observed during the pandemic, namely that the pandemic has given us journalism at its best and its worst. On the best, it has been independent research, statistics, newspapers doing their own research, being a watchdog in a lockdown situation, and engaged stories and reports that have enabled us to understand what is almost impossible to understand in the new situation and a new disease. So the other side of this would be propaganda, conspiracies, secrecy, and the distrust, and of course the vaccine skepticism. So this is the broad picture that we will be going into tonight. But of course, as we know as journalists and readers, what is interesting is to go into the concrete stories, the details, the actual experiences of people. And for that, we have the panel representing 4 countries tonight. So I'm very grateful for you coming and sharing your stories with us and your research. And after the event, we welcome you all to some drinks and snacks and to mingling and continue the discussion in this, just outside this room and on the same floor. So with that, I will give the floor to Kadafi Zaman, a well-known reporter here in Norway. Thank you to you as well, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joachim. It's a great honor to chair this event. We have 3 guests who are here, will be with us physically, and 1 will be from New York in Zoom. So it's a great honor to welcome our first speaker, Marina Urbanikova. She's an assistant professor at Masaryk-universitetet and in the Department of Media Studies and Journalism. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. I have to say that it is my first conference that is not taking place online after 2 years, so I'm excited and I'm in a festive mood, although the topic we have for today is quite demanding and difficult because it will be about the impact of COVID epidemic on journalism and working conditions of journalists and their safety. So to summarize my position, I would say that the pandemic has put media and journalists in a very responsible but also very vulnerable position. And I would say that in general, it has negatively impacted journalists' working conditions and their safety as well. And I mean, or when I say safety, I mean it quite in a broad meaning. So not only physical safety, but also economic or psychological. I will mention these 3 areas in a greater detail. I will start with the economic safety because economic threats are quite obvious. So there have been media companies that went to bankruptcy. There were pay cuts, there were dismissals, layoffs, and so on. So these threats to economic safety of journalism and journalists are well known. In this regard, I would say that the pandemic showed that we need to rethink the media funding model, because as we saw, increased media consumption does not always go hand in hand with increased revenues. So on the one hand, people acutely needed timely and accurate information, so the media consumption went up. But at the very same time, as the pandemic crushed advertising business, this did not help the economic situation of the media that much. So in the end, many journalists in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, but also across the world, witnessed dismissals and pay cuts. Also, I would like to focus on psychological threats, because in short, the journalists had to work more, they had to work longer hours in a much more demanding working conditions and for less pay. So besides these economic threats I mentioned, the pandemic brought also significant psychological threats to journalists, and in particular stress. Especially in the beginning of the pandemic, it was a very busy period for journalists when they had to cover a new and a very complex phenomenon. So they had to learn how to process data, how to distinguish scientific sources from the sources that just pretend to be scientific, and so on. So another problem was that the situation kept on changing. So from the viewpoint of workload, it was a very busy period for everybody who worked for media. At the same time, the working conditions deteriorated, and everyday work of the journalists became much more difficult. And I would say that there are at least 6 reasons for this. So to start, the journalists had to change their working routines and everyday practices very quickly, because similarly to general public, they also had to adhere to the strict COVID-19 security measures. So many of them worked from homes. They had to rely on phone calls, emails, video calls, and so on. So they had to change their working routines very quickly. And of course, this in itself is a source of stress. Also, they had a much more difficult access to sources. And this was the case especially for investigative journalists, because sources in investigative journalism very often do not want to share their information online. So these people or these journalists typically rely on in-person meetings, and it was not possible to have them during the pandemic. So the methods of obtaining information and sourcing the news had to be adapted. Second, the journalists had to tackle barriers in access to information. For instance, in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the government limited the number of journalists that were allowed to attend press conferences. And in Hungary, for instance, it was even worse because, as some of you know, Viktor Orbán, the prime minister, decided to use the pandemic as an excuse to limit media freedom even more than before. So the government, for instance, introduced a new piece of legislation, a new law that criminalizes the spread of misinformation. So you can now get a 5-year sentence in prison for that, and this had a cooling effect on sources. Also, the journalists were not allowed to visit hospitals, or they were prohibited from speaking with medical staff. The third reason why I argue that the working conditions of the journalists became much more difficult is that the workload was occasionally increased also due to quarantines in the newsrooms. So, for instance, a journalist working for one of the main quality newspapers in Slovakia told me that for her, the most stressful period occurred when, in the midst of pandemic, the Slovak government fell. And at the same time, the whole newsroom was in quarantine. So she was the only one who was actually able to go outside, attend press conferences, and speak to sources in person. Fourth, and I think that this is very important to mention, the journalists who have children were in a particularly difficult position because in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the school closure was one of the longest one in Europe. So imagine that you work as a journalist, you work from home, but you have to, at the same time, take care of children. And of course, this impacted in particular the female journalists, because this is how the division of paid and unpaid labor looks like, at least in Central and Eastern Europe. Fifth, the pandemic also increased emotional labor of the journalists. Many of them had to cover death, mourning, grief, and so on. Besides, anecdotal evidence I have from some informal discussions with the journalists from Slovakia and the Czech Republic suggests that it was for them also very frustrating and very emotionally difficult to watch the lack of leadership and professionalism and the chaos on the side of political representatives and public administration bodies. Because the number of COVID victims is one of the highest one per million inhabitants in Czech Republic and in Slovakia. So this was additional source of stress for the journalists. Finally, journalists had and still have to face increased online harassment due to their coverage of COVID-19 and in particular vaccination. So again, just to mention one example, in Slovakia, the share of people who completed their vaccination is just around 45 or 46%. So there is quite a loud group of anti-vaxxers, and every time the journalists write something about the epidemic or the restrictions, the measures or vaccination, or they report on people who were not vaccinated and ended up in hospital, or they try to fight misinformation regarding vaccination, they became targets of online harassment and hate speech. For some of them, it is not new because they know it very well from covering other topics like migration, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. But this is another topic which became difficult and which is kind of sensitive. So this again is another additional source of stress. Finally, besides economic safety and psychological safety, there are, of course, issues with physical safety because the journalists were, of course, at risk of being infected by the virus. Also, as I mentioned, online harassment and online threats became an issue, although luckily I have not come across any story in the Central and Eastern Europe about the journalists who actually became targets of physical violence due to their coverage of the pandemic. However, in general, I would expect that due to the current economic condition, yeah, it's my last sentence. Due to the current economic condition of the newsrooms and the lack of funds, I think that this will limit the newsrooms in their effort to increase, in particular, their online safety and security measures. So this would be my 3 points about the security of journalists in the COVID era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. Our next speaker has an experience of decades from professional journalism. He is a professor and head of WITS journalism in Johannesburg, South Africa. Please welcome Mr. Franz Krüger.
Thank you very much. And like Marina, this is the first time in a very long time that one is able to participate in a gathering. So it's great to be here. It's also the first time in at least 2 years that I've been able to travel. So that's also good fun. I want to just say a couple of things about the impact of COVID by way of around the term infodemics. I mean, infodemics, if I understand correctly, was a term that first came from the World Health Organization and really describes a situation where there's an enormous amount of information, much of it is rubbish. And I think it came about, and the World Health Organization felt it important to talk about it because it has such a direct impact on the management of this pandemic around the world. People don't want to go and get their vaccines for various reasons because there is all this misinformation around. And clearly, I think that for me is probably the most important impact of COVID on us as journalists. I mean, I think the physical safety issues and so on, of course, I don't want to downplay those. I think that those are really critical. But I think in some senses, I want to say that the infodemic, as described, is a variant of what First Draft, the organization, calls information disorder. And once one sees it in that larger context, then it becomes clear that the specifics of what we're dealing with around COVID are a sharper and particularly existential version of a problem that we face as journalists more generally. As South Africans, I mean, we've had examples of this. A couple of years ago, a British PR company, Bell Pottinger, got involved in developing, really weaponizing, I think is the word to use, misinformation through social media and through various other tools. And to link this back to safety issues, I mean, there were very direct attacks, physical attacks on journalists as a result of this campaign. I mean, I also have to say with some pride that South African journalists did a remarkable job in exposing what was going on. And in fact, the company collapsed as a result. One has to say with a bit of a satisfying thump. But I think what it illustrates is the ways in which disinformation, whether it's COVID or around something else, trades on and exploits existing tensions and problems and amplifies those. And I want to come back to that in a second. Earlier this year, we had, you may be aware, we had in South Africa an explosion of violence, which was also fueled by misinformation. It happened just after the former President Jacob Zuma was put in jail. And there was a real campaign, particularly via WhatsApp and various other social media platforms, to get people out to cause enormous damage, and they did. And again, this point about how important the resonance of something like that is. It was very striking that the provinces where the violence really took off were the KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, which is where there is a strong presence of supporters for the former president. Other provinces, not so much. And again, you know, if you're going to instigate violence via these means, you know, you've got to find fertile ground, I think. So I want to make 3 points about this, and then I think there'll be a chance to talk more as we go into the more discussive part of this. Firstly, and I made this point and I want to say it again, I think information disorder particularly, and if you want to call it infodemics or whatever variant you want to talk about, to me is probably the most important threat and problem for journalism that we face currently. We're in a situation where the information pool that we work in is polluted. And it has enormous implications for what we can do and how we can do it. That's at a very broad level, and I think that there are many detailed issues that one can spin out. But I think there is little that is more important currently than to take seriously what is going on in the information environment. There are issues of trust, there are issues of ethics, there are issues of accountability, and so on and so forth. So that's number one. I think it's existential, I think it's critical, I think we need to think about it. Number two, context matters enormously. I mean, I think that some of the assumptions that are made, particularly from the global north, about how things work around the world simply don't hold true when you look more closely at other circumstances. Certainly, you know, I mean, Herman Wasserman, a South African academic, has done really important work, I think, to identify the different ways in which African information ecosystems work, and therefore how these disinformation campaigns can and do work. So one has to really think very carefully about the particular context that you're looking at. I mean, just to pick out one aspect that I think is really critical. I think that if one is thinking about African, particularly, information environments, the disparity between information rich and poor is enormous. People don't have access to the richness of media and richness of information that people do elsewhere. And I think that's a big thing. I think it's something that we need to take into account. Finally, I think there's a real need, and this is, I suppose, a point for researchers and academics. I think there's a real need for much more detailed audience studies. Again, Herman Wasserman just recently published a paper where he asked people in Kenya, I think, and South Africa, did they ever pass on misinformation? And a surprisingly large percentage of people said yes, they did. A slightly smaller percentage, but nevertheless a big percentage, said they had knowingly passed on misinformation. Why did they do it? A sense of duty, in case it was true, a sense of amusement. So I think for us to counter misinformation, whether it's you know, the infodemic around COVID or whether it's wider issues, in order to develop the countermeasures that work, we need to take into account context and we need to take into account audiences. And I think what we will find is that very often it is the affective, the emotional side of things that makes an enormous difference. We can't assume simply that people, as the moment that they know that something is false, then they'll just dismiss it. It doesn't work like that. Information kind of sharing and so on, particularly on these closed message groups, are way more complex than that. So those are my points, and I look forward to more of a discussion in a minute. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Franz. Our next speaker is a senior information security analyst at the New York Times. Her name is Nina Kapoor, and she researches and implements security solutions to combat modern threats to both journalists and media houses. She will be joining us by Zoom.
Okay. All right. Let's do this. All right, good to go. Hi, everyone. My name is Nina Kapoor, and I'm a senior manager of information security at the New York Times. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all today and learning from you all as we collectively kick off the Safety for Journalism conference. I've been participating in this conference for a couple of years now, and I'm always learning so much from all the different diverse backgrounds that come here. And I hope that in this conversation, which I'll keep brief so we can get to the panel, we can kind of talk a little bit about what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about responding and supporting journalism safety at the New York Times, and also in the context of what we call an infodemic, which I know is the word of the day, it seems. So quick background, I'm based in New York. I oversee the intelligence and security teams within the information security, the intelligence and the education teams within the New York Times information security team. So what that means is I'm looking at the different kinds of threats that are targeting journalists and trying to understand defenses that work for that and to prevent those threats and to detect them, as well as working directly with the newsroom. The team does to train journalists for various, high pressure, high security risk situations where they may need additional security controls or even just some threat modeling support to really identify the risks involved in what they're covering, where they're going, so on and so forth. I've been at the New York Times for about 4 years now, and in that 4 years, as I'm sure all of us here in this room are aware, the journalism threat landscape has really kept on changing and kept us on our toes. And we've learned every year of different kinds of threats and different kinds of capabilities that we need to think about and look out for and prepare for. I love my cat. I love reading and eating ramen, in case that's helpful also. So I know folks have been talking about this, but what's an infodemic? And the reason why I like to start with this is because I actually had no idea about this word until very recently. And I think that's because I've been treating what is an infodemic as misinformation and distrust with the media. And I think it's important to kind of hone in on a few key parts of the definition. Too much information, including false or misleading information, in digital and physical environments during a disease outbreak. It causes confusion and risk-taking behaviors that can harm health. It also leads to mistrust in health authorities and undermines the public health response. These are the parts that are important to me. False or misleading information in digital and physical environments. So we see this kind of blended threat model that we have been following for years now, where we can't just talk about threats in a digital environment versus a physical space. They overlap quite a bit. Sometimes they start online, end up physical, or vice versa. And it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about responses and security controls. And the last is mistrust in health authorities. And obviously, journalists aren't health authorities, but the pure piece of this is just mistrust in authorities, governing organizations, experts, as well as in the independent media and independent news organizations. And what does that look like? So this boils down to what we've been thinking about and tracking and watching evolve for years, right? Misinformation and disinformation leading to mistrust, discrediting, and fundamentally really increased targeting of journalists that are doing their reporting on these topics. And so I kind of like to separate myself from the word infodemic and start drilling down into the capabilities and tactics that we need to think about when considering what comes from an infodemic. And then on the flip side, the impact of that when thinking about security controls and how we can kind of protect journalists, as well as build better kind of frameworks for detection. So just here are a couple of examples of things that we see, things I'm sure you all have seen. So government and state-sponsored media putting forth inaccurate information about testing rates for COVID. Extremist groups posting information on social media to spread false narratives about what the vaccine will do to you. Individuals sharing incorrect information with trusted groups on how to prevent COVID. So these are all different types of groups and individuals that have different levels of trust with their audience, that are sharing information that are inaccurate and false with the intent, whatever that intent is, of spreading a specific narrative related to the disease outbreak. And what I think is important for all of this is thinking through that an infodemic has a lot of very familiar challenges and security concerns, as other types of digital security threats and environments that we're looking at. Tactics are consistent, although intents are different. I think that's what's important when trying to kind of really think about critically, how do we protect ourselves? How do we, what is the security response and what does the threat look like? I like to use this diagram when thinking about capabilities and tactics, whether it's in an infodemic or beyond, right? And this is a non-comprehensive list, so I'm sure folks here are experts in different spaces for all of this. But the reason I like to point it out is because when you look at this initial list, you can already see how different tactics overlap and how they influence each other. And breaking it down by legal, physical, and digital only just helps us digest it, but at the same time, we oftentimes know that online harassment can lead to physical violence, right? And those are both tactics that are going to be used to achieve a purpose from the variety of different groups out there that are trying to push their narratives or trying to push their information out there and undermine accurate facts. And in terms of an infodemic in particular, these tactics and the impact of targeting are all too familiar. The intent of targeting is what's different. And so this little diagram here, again, while it's not comprehensive, we can think about it and apply it when thinking about impact, and also when thinking about specific areas of coverage for journalists. Who's at risk? How is certain coverage going to trigger perhaps these tactics being used for targeting of the individual or the media organization? This is a lot of text, I'm sorry. But the thing I think is important is kind of when breaking it down and preparing for the problem, when thinking about what the actual issue is and fundamentally what the risk is. And so asking ourselves these questions is kind of what gets us there. And so I've gone ahead and filled this out in the context of an infodemic, but I think you can already tell that these questions help us just generally in various hostile security environments start thinking through security measures that need to take place based off of the impact and based off the capabilities and tactics. What I think is interesting and important here, and I know I've spoken about this in previous years, and I always listen and learn from other folks speaking about this as well, is, historically, we oftentimes think about these security threats and journalists targeting political reporters, foreign correspondents. And this, infodemic, as well as just past experiences in the past decade or so, really just demonstrates that there's always hot button issues out there in spaces that we may not anticipate, and reporters covering a variety of topics are at risk. So in this case, anyone covering a COVID beat is at risk. One of the things that I've seen amazingly at specific science writers conferences for reporters covering science beats or climate related beats is this increase in discussion about security, right? Because in the past 4 or 5 years, these various groups that are that are pushing narratives that are trying to demonstrate or discredit science are now targeting those reporters covering those beats. So again, while fundamentally it's not that different, we know that reporters covering various topics are always at risk. I think when honing in for the infodemic, really thinking through the safety and security of health of reporters covering health beats, science, climate, public health, public response, fall into that category of high risk, depending on what they're specifically talking about. Who's doing the targeting? We talked about this. We have state-sponsored actors, coordinated grassroots groups, anti-vaccine groups, and then lone wolves, which are just a single individual who may just become, develop an obsession with a specific topic. And they're oftentimes very, very threatening and, have credible threats that need to be followed up on. Why are they doing this? And then how are they doing this, right? And this goes back to our kind of list of tactics and capabilities. What are the tactics and capabilities that we can break down and understand based off the group or individual that might be doing the targeting? And then last and most important is really, what is the impact, right? What are we concerned about if their capabilities succeed? Is that silencing and intimidation? Is that psychological trauma from ongoing harassment? Is it misinformation on a specific topic? Or it does lead to reputational damage, source compromise. Again, the list goes on and on. But considering the impact is, again, going to help us assess what we need to do. And also, the severity of the threat when considering how to prepare ahead of time. I'll run through this very quick example. I'm not going to share any specific examples from the Times just due to, just privacy concerns, but I want to talk about this because I've dealt with this in a variety of ways at this point. Investigative journalists, investigating actual details of a government response to COVID. And we have to think about a series of different kinds of threats pre-publication and post-publication to understand how we can proactively secure journals ahead of time. But there's always going to be some sort of reactive security response, because once these post-publication threats emerge, something has to be kind of considered. You need to weigh decisions for protecting the journalist, protecting the reputation, and also considering the reputation of the organization as well. And so, again, I won't bore you by listing all of these, but these are, again, threats that we consider when thinking through capabilities and also the groups involved. So maybe for a state-sponsored group, we're thinking about surveillance or physical intimidation to prevent something from being published, or to keep tabs on the journalists, or to extract information. So after the publication comes out, they can attempt to discredit the journalist or the source or the organization. Physical violence or intimidation also can come from some of these extremist groups as well, at protests or through online harassment that indicates physical threats, things of that sort. So these are all coming from different sources, but still helps us kind of hone in on what's going to happen pre-publication that we can prepare for. And then post-publication is coordinated smear campaigns, discrediting work, coordinating social media campaigns, and so on and so forth, right? Again, the list goes on, but figuring out what this looks like by discussing it ahead of time, and also by looking through trends for trends for targeting across the journalism space is pretty important. And the piece here that I think is also important to really consider is, once we do all that, right, we've listed all these scary things that can happen, let's actually drill down into the safety and security concerns, right? And there aren't too many of them when we actually drill into the really fundamentals, but of course they're big concerns. Physical safety at home and in public, digital security of devices, accounts, and network to protect sources in your data, mental health, enduring ongoing targeted harassment and threats, and reputation based off online campaigns attempting to discredit work. What does that mean for future publication? And through all of this, we can kind of start thinking about, we can see the impact, we can see these tactics, and now let's understand the likelihood based off what we're seeing across the board. And as we're all discussing, and we're here to discuss as a group, is the word infodemic exists because this is something that is likely and happens regularly, and it's almost a predictable cycle when new information about COVID-related data comes out. A couple of quick things I'll just share about just security actions of the New York Times. And a lot of these are questions that we ask ourselves and we consider when thinking about proactive security versus reactive security. For proactive security, a lot of this comes down to threat modeling. So it's asking ourselves questions like, what am I trying to protect? Who am I protecting it from? What can those people or individuals or groups do? What are their capabilities? What are the worst case scenarios if they succeed, right? If they succeed in targeting me or compromising my device, what could they actually get? And from there, we can start building out, what are the things that I can do to protect that information? What are the things I can do to prevent this from happening? And in some cases, we cannot prevent it from happening, right? But the best case scenario is we could have a security plan. If the going gets rough, we are prepared for blowback. We can monitor for threats and harassment. We have a pipeline to report, information to, law enforcement or to social media accounts and things of that sort. We can provide, protective gear if people are going to more hostile environments, things of that sort. And for reactive security, there's a playbook in place, but I think the key piece is we're also weighing a lot of factors and asking ourselves these questions. When and how should people being harassed respond? Initially, the initial kind of gut feeling is I want to respond, I want to set the record straight, but oftentimes responding stokes more harassment and it brings more attention to the issue. So how can we weigh that? How can we protect the individual while also, making sure that they're able to have control over their narrative and empowered to kind of, make statements and push back against harassment and threats while keeping them protected? How can we monitor for threats without putting the traumatic burden on the individual to read them all? And this is an important one, right? If I want to see if credible threats are coming through, I would like somebody to let me know. I would like to, have something from, DMs or comments or so on and so forth. And so thinking about whether it's a friend, an editor, a security team, whatever, supporting an individual who's being targeted and harassed to actually go through that information so that individual is not burdened with doing it and also sustaining all the harassment, it's important. And then the last is credible threats versus non-credible threats. They're all horrific, right? People can say absolutely awful things that are horrible, but at the same time, from the perspective of really assessing the risk, we need to think about which ones are groups or actors or individuals that may actually act on the threat. And if that's the case, then that also increases the risk and then therefore changes how we're going to react and respond from a security perspective. Just a couple, just takeaways as I wrap up and pass the baton on to the other folks here for the panel is infodemic is a word. And I think it's really important to emphasize this when thinking about tactics and impact, right? How is the safety and security concerns impacting journalists and individuals, organizations, and what are the tactics that are being used? And these are things that, are fundamentally not different, but the intent of the groups behind this stuff is very, that's what changes with an infodemic versus other environments of misinformation, disinformation. The other thing is, anticipating blowback for COVID stories and prepare. I think historically, perhaps hasn't been thought to be as much of a hot button issue as, covering various flu outbreaks and things of that sort. But COVID clearly is. And so really understanding that reporters, freelancers who are covering this beat are at a different kind of risk now, and anticipating that blowback and building out security plans. And then last but not least, and I think this is really what helps with the likelihood component of considering the risk, is sharing experiences, tactics, and observations. Infodemic exists because we see things happening and we see it happening fast, but to actually get down to the root of the threat, the root of the problem, the source, the countries that may be stoking the specific violence, sharing those experiences and observations and that data is paramount to kind of preparing journalists in different locations, different countries, and covering different topics ahead of publication. And so with that, I will stop there. Thank you.
Did you hear the applause? Thank you, Nina. Thank you for giving us a concrete picture of how you're dealing with this in the New York Times. So, you know, since we're having a panel debate afterwards without you, maybe we could take one or two questions now. Anyone who wants to come up or sort of just say it out, and I will try to pass it on. We have 1 minute for that now, so please feel free.
I could try to yell, maybe it gets through. I would be interested in the individual risk assessments with the journalists under threat. Do you use a common standardized framework for that, or do you first map the individual context, the individual threats, and start from there?
Were you able to hear that?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. I heard it. It's a great question. So we use a general series of questions, I think, to start a proactive threat modeling exercise with an individual. And those questions are, versions of them exist. The Freedom of the Press Foundation has them on their site. The Electronic Frontier Foundation also kind of a socialized threat modeling exercise. And they start with really thinking about, the questions themselves are, what am I protecting? Who am I protecting them from? What are the capabilities of the groups I'm protecting them from? What is the likelihood of that happening? And what is a worst case scenario if that happens? And from there, what are the steps that I can take to mitigate these situations? Thinking through the, also how much trouble you want to go through, right? For a worst case scenario, if it's unlikely, you know, what do we want to do? And I think from there, from those questions, it becomes a very customized security plan, depending on the individual and the area of coverage. And that security plan becomes customized in that last question when thinking through specific mitigations. And so those mitigations, you know, depending on the area of coverage, depending on where they're traveling, so on and so forth, can range from really considering technical means of locking down devices, data accounts, building in detections on the device itself to determine if there's a level of compromise, if the risk is higher, all the way as well to just thinking through literally playbooks of source communication, right? If you're going to go to this country where we expect this level of surveillance, or you're investigating this topic where this country has historically used Pegasus spyware, how can we proactively build out, you know, a step-by-step plan for talking to a source? Or how can we perhaps think about swapping out your phone or wiping it and having an analysis after you conduct, or you go out to, you know, conduct your reporting. I think those are kind of the important customizations that come at the end, but the standard set of questions I think applies to everyone. And I think also helps in many cases decrease fears in certain situations, right? Because oftentimes if the likelihood is pretty low of something happening, we can actually think about, you know, some good basic level security precautions, and then really save some of those more, quite frankly, burdensome security steps that change your processes and change your workflows for situations where, as a group, we can kind of assess the likelihood is high.
Okay, good. Thank you again. We will move on from here. Thank you very much for your contribution. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, I can start by saving you some time. My name is Øyvind. I'm the development editor of VG, the biggest Norwegian newspaper. So I was asked to tell you a bit about how we covered the corona crisis. And for VG, that was kind of a fairy tale story. So some positive vibes inside here. And Norway, of course, is a different story than Africa, even if we have our own problems. I'll start to... Okay, maybe I'll use... this is VG in the 80s. Kadafi worked there maybe some years later. And this was a famous first front page. It was like a sex doll made the person got the virus. That was like a big story for us in the 80s. And couple of years later, a boy was born in the toilet. That was front page stuff and great for VG. And it was even better when he, 23 years later, became a plumber. So VG is a tabloid newspaper, and we're proud of that. But in the pandemic and nowadays, it's kind of a different story. We are #1 in Norway, but when the virus hit the world, it was a discussion. Will this be big or not? As late as 28th of February, Trump said that it would just go away, and it was no cases in Norway yet at that time. So the next day we had 21 cases in Norway, and it started to we started to understand this is going to be something big. And what do we do when something like this happens? Yeah, we make stories, as we always do. Some good stories as well, but very traditional coverage. You see, this is like articles with a headline, totally 19 corona patients in Norway. So one day, I think it was the 1st of March, these people were talking together, and they're working with editorial development, which is like technologists and journalists in one, and journalists. And they were having a conversation, and one of them, Sondre, he said, I was thinking about maybe making a special story with numbers and stuff, and maps and stuff. And Oda replied, yeah, that sounds good. I'll be at my desk in an hour. So let's chat about this. So they started to register cases very, very manually. Cities to the left, and some codes with the counties and dates. And at the start, where was these people getting the infection? So very manually in a spreadsheet, we started to register it. And just 3 days later, we decided to publish what we call the Corona Special. And for us, that was telling numbers from the world, but also from Norway. This was not very well done at the time. We just got it out. And we worked more with sources. Here we had to say where did the people get the disease. China and Italy. Italy was very big in Norway in the beginning. And we started to get some reward. Then this is the 5th of March. We could have a story about where are the most of the people getting the disease. Yeah, it was in Italy because of the skiing in the Alps. And we decided to make it local searchable because it's very important for people to know how the disease is in their area. If you're living in Tromsø, you don't care if someone is having corona in Oslo, maybe, because it's a long country. But when you can check it very closely where you live, this was a big success. So the 11th of March, VG, which is the tabloid newspaper, as I told you, could tell, now we have over 600 cases in Norway. But the government, they could say 489. So at the time, very early in the pandemic, VG could have a more reliable information than the government. So that was kind of cool for us, maybe not so good for Norway as a country if I was like Prime Minister. And the interest was very big for this. Of course, Norway have like 5.3 million people or something, and VG has, in a very good day, 30 million page views maybe. And we saw that we reached numbers about 1.7 million, the 10th of March, clicks on this, the Corona Special, as we call it. This is the 12th of March, the Prime Minister...
Sterkeste og mest inngripende tiltakene vi har hatt I Norge I fredstid.
Yeah. It was like the lockdown day in Norway. The 12th of March, I think a lot of people in Norway will remember that date. And this was Oslo at the time, not very many people in the streets. And we understood that this one is going to be very big journalistically, and it's going to last for a very long time. And for VG, we understood that our role in this would be a very serious role. We have to tell the people what's happening, and also, of course, being critical to the government. So the number of views was like, was the best day in all the pandemic period, 4.6 million clicks on the day. And as I said, it's 5 million people in the country, and some kids as well. So basically everyone was clicking on this. which was, of course, we were kind of proud of. So then we decided we have to work more on this. So the guys behind it, they decided to make a better system instead of just pumping out information. And that was smart. It showed later. We relaunched it with more information. Okay, do you know what this is? It's okay, anyone want to guess? Oh, it's a cockpit in a Concorde. So, and it was like some of the same thing for us, because you have a lot of options when you're making a kind of feature like this. And it was important for us not to choose everything, because then it will be not easy to understand for people. So we chose to do something, for example, difference between nations, and we made a world admin, and we made more like tabs in the special with the vaccines and deaths and different things, which made the product better, but people could still understand it, which was important for us. And we could check how it was in one municipality like now, and for example some months ago, so we could see like how everything was going. Yeah, and we launched this. This was not the Concorde thing. This is very easy to understand. Is it increasing or decreasing the corona situation? And we put this on the front page. So like in the first view, you could see how is its status right now. Now we're in the summer of 2020. What we understood was this was a very big task for our newspaper. It was like maybe 30 people working on it, and more than 10 of them working full time to keep this updated. Yeah, we made more features. Green countries that you can visit if you did not want to go to quarantine when you come home. We could also see which countries who will be red or green based on algorithms in the system. And we made the vaccine development, and then we decided to get all local measures together in one place. So we sent an email to all the municipalities in Norway and asked, could you tell us what's the status in your area? And 1/3 of them answered, and the rest we had to find ourselves. And this is kind of thing, I think if it's going to be a new pandemic in like 5 years, I think the government will understand that maybe it's a nice thing to have this kind of information in one place. But this wasn't the case in Norway. So this was also very popular, of course, because we have 350 different rules at the same time. So in Oslo, for example, you could have 2 guests, but in Tromsø, maybe you can have 20. So that was not so easy for people to remember, and even the Prime Minister didn't remember the rules, so she had too many guests in her party. Yeah, and the vaccine process important at the end of the 2020. I think the first dose was 27th of December. Yeah. And this is one of the chiefs of the official Norway, Espen Nakstad. He has praised VG for the job, and he said that we hoped that he would say, "You have saved lives," but he didn't say exactly those words. So he said it had made the work for infection control easier. But I think it was that what he meant. And we have won a lot of awards for this. And our position as a news brand in Norway has risen, and we are of course happy with that. And it says and tells me that fact-based journalism, it's like the most important thing, and it's the revenge of the nerds. If you think about the picture in the start with the doll, this is kind of like a new era for facts. So this is the number of people in Norway have clicked on the special at the time. So it's okay. Yeah. So for VG, this has been the most important thing in the corona coverage. But just to mention in this room, we have also had a lot of investigative journalism, for example, regarding kids in foster homes who didn't get the good best of care and stuff. So we have also been critical. And for the government, they didn't give us everything. We had to work quite hard to get the numbers, manually calling, emailing, and it doesn't come as easy as we would like it to, but the result, I think it made a lot of people's choices easier. Yeah.